Well, the more I researched, the more I found that there was this subset of missing that were hunters. And these were armed. And the more I looked into it, the odder the cases became, because a majority of these hunters would go to the exact same location year after year after year. And sometimes the property was in the family for 40, 50 years.
Right.
Sometimes they went to the same U.S. Forest Service area and hunted the same zone time after time. And so these people knew the area like the back of their hand. And many of the disappearances happened on property that had been in the family for 70 years, and nobody could understand how they could disappear or how they could be lost. And you got to remember, these are formidable opponents.
And they all have rifles.
Yeah.
My gosh.
Rifles, pistols, bows, arrows, they come equipped. They know the area. The one unique part of this is that many of them disappeared within a time span that was very slim when they were alone. When I wrote the book, I didn't realize how many hunters don't know that in an emergency or when they're lost, they fire off 3 rounds. And it's not something that's universally taught in hunter safety classes, I found out. And a lot of the guys don't know that you should be carrying about 16 to 20 extra rounds, because every hour, if you're lost, stay in one place, fire off 3 rounds. And they'll slowly hone in on that signal. Well, if you don't have the rounds with you, you can't do it. So the truth of the matter is that it's very, very rare that anybody ever hears 3 rounds. It's pretty normal to hear 1 round, but that could be just another hunter in an area shooting at an animal. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of these guys that I write about are too old to go far. They're placed in a zone, sometimes in a chair, and said, hey, you just wait here and we'll herd the deer towards you. And a lot of times they'll come back later on, and the person had a radio, they had a gun, and they come back, and not only is the gun gone, the radio's gone, the hunter's gone, they bring in canines, they can't track. It's the same sort of situation that I've described in previous cases. And then the headlines in the paper later on is community baffled by missing hunter, it makes no sense, blah, blah, blah. It's the same sort of thing. But the reason the book's important to me is that this is probably the most formidable opponent, the most knowledgeable person in the field to get lost. Most of these guys have compasses. They're dressed for the weather. They're carrying maps. They're carrying guns. They've hunted the area in the past. They wouldn't be somebody who would be considered easy prey, because they're stalking and looking themselves, and they're watching the environment, probably not in the same way someone just casually walking a trail on a daily hike.
David, are any of the bodies of the missing hunters ever discovered?
Rarely, if ever. Well, you know what's strange is that if you read the search and rescue or the law enforcement reports, there's this attitude out there that, well, we search for them, we can't find them. It's obviously they don't say this in the report, but it's obviously their mistake. You know what? We did the best we could. It's over. And that is a standalone case in one county every 10 years. It really has no relevance. But then if I pull together 20 of those exact same kind of cases in the same state over 25 years, then those profile points that existed in that case start to mean something. And the family of that victim doesn't have closure. It's horrible. It's the worst kind of loss you can imagine. I wouldn't say a time frame other than late afternoon, usually about 3 or 4 o'clock, is the most common time for him to not show up and disappear. The most common type of hunter to disappear is a bow hunter, and that's by a pretty significant margin. And I know a lot of bow hunters, and yes, they go out bow hunting, but they also carry a pretty large caliber firearm with them, especially the guys hunting up north because of grizzly bear. But one of the things I put in all of my books, George, is that I try to encourage people to go out and purchase a personal locator beacon. And the reason for that is that I think about 90% of the cases I write about, the people would have been found if they had this. And a 79-year-old guy named Fortunato Rivera, this is out of Maine, November 13th, 93 at 10 o'clock, he goes into an area near Corinth and a place called Hunt Lake. And he went in there with his son and his grandson. And his son had owned this property for quite a while, had taken his dad there before. And he put his dad into a hunting blind not far from where he and his other son were at. They were all residents in New Jersey. They had driven up the night before. And after the son walked Fortunato into the hunting stand, he said, "Hey, I'll be back in 30 minutes for you just to check on you." The guy wasn't real mobile, old, decrepit, knew exactly where he was going to stay. Well, his son left. Again, he wasn't gone long. He comes back, and his dad was gone. And so the son goes and gets his son, the father's grandson, comes back, and they start screaming for their grandpa, Fortunato. And they're not hearing anything. They don't see anything. There's no tracks. So they search for a few hours. They give up. They call in search and rescue, and they bring in the Maine Warden Service. Well, they find nothing the following day, and they searched all day. They brought in canines. They weren't finding any scent. The following day, on a Monday, the searchers find Fortunato's body face up in a shallow reservoir 20 feet from shore. He was not wearing his coat, shirt, or boots. This is in mid-November, and he had to have climbed over a small mountain through a boulder-strewn area to even get to that location. A ranger stated that he had to have walked at least 2 miles. The coroner stated that he died of hypothermia and a heart attack. Well, he walked in the opposite direction of where his son walked him into. This was in the middle of November. It was cold. And in my past book, Missing 411, A Sobering Coincidence, I explained in detail the death of people, men and women, and how their body reacts in water. And a man's body, 99.9% of the time, if you die in water, you'll die face down. Fortunato was face up. Very, very strange. He wasn't mobile, and his son had a problem with this, as did the Warden Service, about how he went to that area, how he got there, why he went there, how he ended up in the water, why he would have taken off his boots. None of it made any sense at all. And he was seated in a seat. His son had said he'd be back with him within 30 minutes, and within that period of time, he disappeared, hiked 2 miles, and he was elderly and semi-decrepit. How does that happen? They're saying that he died of hypothermia and a heart attack. Now, I will say this, that in past books, I've coined a phrase from a New York detective, and that is local reports for local consumption. And what this detective meant, and I think it's perfect, is that in order to soothe the concerns of a local community, a coroner will sometimes come in with a verdict that really can't be substantiated. And what I found was, in a lot of these cases where the family went out and got a second opinion, it was 180 degrees from what that coroner said the first time. And to get a second opinion on a coroner usually costs between $2,000 and $5,000, so it's a wealthy thing to do. And a lot of people can't afford it, but the vast majority of the time, the decision on the cause of death is polar opposite of what the local coroner says. Let's stay in Maine for the time being. A place called Garfield Plantation. Again, we're going to talk about a 70-year-old man, Robert Smith. This is in far northern Maine, south of Portage Lake, kind of adjacent to the Machias River. This guy was a super experienced deer hunter. He had just had cancer, went through all the recovery. Doctor gave him a clean bill of health, and he was excited because he got the okay from the doctor to go hunting with his 3 brothers and his wife. And this was in a hunting camp that they had owned for decades on the outskirts of Garfield, Maine. First time he was getting out and felt good, and he was with his family. This was November 18th, 97. Robert's wife walked with him to the hunting stand, and his brothers went to their hunting stand, and everyone got into them, and the wife was sitting in it with Robert. They were within gunshot range of hearing each other. Well, at 2:30 p.m., they hadn't seen any deer. They hadn't seen anything, which was unusual for that area. And Robert told his wife he was going to walk a half circle in the area to see what he could stir up. So he climbed down the tree, He was carrying his rifle and wearing a bright orange vest. Well, at about 5 o'clock, it was starting to get dark, and Mrs. Smith started to get worried because he hadn't come back. And she walked over to the nearby deer stand to get the other brothers to start looking for Robert. Well, by 6 o'clock, they couldn't find him, and they called the warden service. There was a 9-day search, 18,000 acres, 250 wardens responded, searched along with professional law enforcement. National Guard units came in. 2 planes searched with FLIR. 2 helicopters searched with FLIR. There were multiple canine teams that came in, and this is an odd one. The Naval Evasion School sent 20 personnel to assist. Very interesting. The Naval Evasion School is attached to one of my stories regarding a lady named Geraldine Largay that disappeared on the Appalachian Trail in Maine 2 years ago. She was found on their property dead, even though that property had been searched. There's a side story to that Naval Evasion School I could talk for hours about. But during the search, fog and snow hit the search area multiple days and slowed the efforts. On November 24th, 97, or 6 days after Robert disappeared, the most senior game warden on the scene made this statement. He said, this case has us totally baffled. Well, they continued to search on for weeks. The family paid for extra searchers to come in. 1 year after Robert vanished, his family went back again with another large contingent of family members and private searchers and found nothing. A year later, hoping to find something. Robert owned the property for decades and knew it like you and I know our backyards, had a rifle, and was wearing a bright orange vest. He was never found. And why wouldn't you at least find the vest? Now, this area of northern Maine also contains a story that I wrote about where 2 Maine wardens disappeared in the early 1900s under very unusual circumstances. We won't go into the story today, but this area of northern Maine, right near the Canadian border, there's a lot of weird stuff that goes on, and this family never got closure. But this is one of those stories that isn't so abnormal. But where could this man who just got over cancer, how far could he walk? There seems to be an abnormal number of people that have a German heritage. And I almost fell out of my chair when the sheriff came back and handed me the report on this guy who went missing in Rocky Mountain National Park in February of 1983. He was 27 years old. His name was Rudy Moder. Rudy was a German national on vacation. He had prior time with the German Mountain Army Corps.
Oh, my
gosh.
He
was a veteran of 2 different Himalayan trips, and he was considered an expert in mountaineering and extreme weather conditions. Well, he came out to see a friend that lived outside of Denver, and he was traveling with him, and he said, hey, just give me a couple, 3 days, and I want to go into the back country of the park, and I just want to see what it's like here. He took all of his equipment. His friend dropped him off. He had some cross-country skis, and he goes, I'll meet you here in 3 days. You know, this guy was elite of the elite and in prime physical shape. So he didn't make it back. His friend called the sheriff. The sheriff came out and searched, and it was a 4-day search, 40 searchers. They did find a small cave that they know that he dug because there was a food cache in it that he had put there. So they do overflights. There were 2 helicopters committed by the Park Service. They don't find anything. But what's more perplexing to this is that we're looking at 30-plus years now. They've never found him, which, okay, maybe you don't find him, but where's the skis? Where's the bindings? Where's his belt? Where's his boots that he was wearing? He's never found. He was in an area called Thunder Pass. You and I wouldn't even think about going there. And an avalanche, they came back the following year, they searched, they never found him. And so there wasn't any avalanche activity in the area when they searched. There was nothing. It's like, you know, whoosh, he's gone. There's one case out of the Yukon Territory I can think of where they thought that a bear might have attacked him. Well, it's strange because in reports written in articles and newspapers and things, it says that there's bear scat found at the scene with his clothing in the scat. Well, I interviewed the natural resource officer on that case. His name was Bart Schleier, the stud of all studs, a mountain man, a graduate of Montana State, and an expert on bear. And the natural resource officer who investigated that case for Yukon said, Dave, it was an absolute lie. There was no clothing. I don't know where they got that. I don't know who said it, but it didn't come from me, and I was the guy in charge of the investigation. Well, if you think about that, the point I made earlier about found in a place that was previously searched. So there's one case in particular where they took the same trail out to find this boy for a week. They don't find him. The 8th day, they're going, hundreds of people go out the same trail. And on the 8th day, they're getting up, they leave, and there's a tree that's been knocked down or fell down is laying across the trail. And George, the boy's body is laying on top of the tree. Now, I don't care who you are. You've got to think, there's a message there somewhere. They for sure want us to find that body. But then my question is, where was this boy during the previous times? And in search and rescue, the coroners and the medical examiners are never thinking like you and I. The search and rescue professionals are thinking, hey, we found the body, great, our job's done. Now, in my last book, where the people were found in water, water's a different environment in that you can gauge based on the temperature of the water how long somebody's there based on the degradation of the body. Well, some super smart medical examiners on a few of these cases were really paying attention, and they realized, the guy's been missing for 2 weeks. He only shows indications of being in the water for 3 days. Where's he been for the last 7 to 10 days? And a lot of medical examiners don't want to rock the boat. And there's 2 of them that I talk to regularly about this. They know something really strange is going on. They know that it's not normal for them not to find a cause of death. And in the cases I write about, a high percentage of time, the coroners can't find a cause of death. Kenny was 47 years old, disappeared November 10th, 2014, and he liked to put up YouTube videos. And they were good. And I thought they were really interesting because he'd take you into a desert landscape and talk about it, and I actually learned a lot. And one of these times he went into this area and he came out, and what he said was, when I went into this cave, it made my whole body vibrate. And he said, it's the strangest cave I've ever experienced. And he got out of there. He was alone, scared and bad. And again, if you go online, search his name, V-E-A-C-H, Kenny, you'll find the video. And he explained that this cave is kind of shaped like a big M's and Mary. And he left, and he thought about it for a few weeks, and he came back, and he was carrying a gun, and he said, I'm going to try to find this cave. Well, during that effort to find the cave, he disappeared. And near one cave's entrance, they found his cell phone outside the cave. Now, to a lot of people, that might not mean a lot. To me, it does, because the victims that disappear, 99% of the time, never disappear with their cell phone, a GPS device, or a firearm. Now, they found this phone in an area where they weren't sure if that was the cave he was talking about or not. They did send a remote viewer camera down into the cave, and they said he wasn't inside. But the idea about that it made him shake, vibrate, and it gave him an uncomfortable feeling, so much so that he left, is intriguing to me. And when you listen to him, you could hear that the guy was scared. And there was a big search. They searched every cave in that area. It was weird. So I can think of a couple times in my life where I have been seriously afraid for my life. And I actually started to shake. Could have been nerves, could have been something else. I don't know. Now, again, that's one of those things that I mean, I'm a slow learner, but I'll walk that path for a while until if something finally hits me in the head and says, Dave, wake up. But I wrote a couple books, and I included just the stories of what search and rescue said, what law enforcement said, and I kept saying those things. They said, well, and the victim was found in an area that had been searched multiple times. The victim was found on a trail that was used by search and rescue people every day when we walked in and out. Now, I say this too, and I think it's important to be said, is that I am not pointing a finger at search and rescue and law enforcement and saying they did an inferior job and they missed that person. Because I don't think that person was there when they were looking. Especially the times where they say that they were walking that trail every day, and they never found him. Earlier this year, I was going to Rhode Island to watch my son play a playoff hockey game, and a medical examiner that I'd been communicating with from the East Coast, from a very, very large jurisdiction, had contacted me earlier in the year, said that she had read the books, and said, we got to talk, we got to meet. So we met in Rhode Island. And she said, Dave, you are into something here that medical examiners that do a lot of cases know what's going on. They know this is occurring, they don't know why it's occurring, and they can't explain it. And part of these cases, George, that I profiled in the book, a large percentage of those incidents, the coroners can't determine the cause of death. I mean, normally in society, especially when I was a policeman, I've never heard of that. Now, in my conversations with this coroner, they stated that in the old days, there was a lot of political pressure to clear a case and offer an explanation to the community so that there would be acceptance. And as time is going on, they stated that there still is that pressure, whether it's subliminal or overt in certain places, but how strong that medical examiner is to stand up and say, hey, I'm not an idiot, but I can't figure it out, and say that straight up. Or do they say, the person died of hypothermia, which is one of those kind of murky things that there are some things with the stomach and marks that they can find, but sometimes they really can't. And so a lot of times on those older cases, I'll read, well, the person or the child died of hypothermia. I read that all the time in old cases. Nowadays, I'm reading more and more where they can't determine the cause of death, even of the adults. I would say that probably 60 to 75% are deceased. Well, I should say deceased, or you don't find them. I mean, there's cases that you and I talk about where people are found 4 or 5 years later. And the strangeness factor doesn't leave. The finding of the remains even offers more ambiguity to the entire situation.